Hi, Grandma here, and I'm reading The Call of the Wild by Jack London. And we have been introduced to the main character, who is a dog, and his name is Buck. To review a little bit, I'm going to read a description of Buck. He was not so large, he weighed only 140 pounds, for his mother, Shep, had been a Scottish sheepdog. His father was a St. Bernard. Nevertheless, 140 pounds, to which was added the dignity that comes of good living and universal respect, enabled him to carry himself in right royal fashion. During the 4 years since his puppyhood, he had lived the life of a sated aristocrat. He had a fine pride in himself, was a trifle egotistical, as country gentlemen sometimes become. So Buck is a dog, but he is a very special dog. He has been placed in he had a place of honor and respect within his family, and he didn't really mingle with the other dogs. He considered himself above them. Sadly, he trusted one of the gardener's helpers, Manuel, too much, and Manuel has kidnapped him and sold him to go to the Northlands, which is Yukon, to the gold rush. He has been thrown on a baggage car, and that's where we pick up the story. In my book, it's at the bottom of page 8. The next he knew, he was dimly aware that his tongue was hurting and that he was being jolted along in some kind of conveyance. The hoarse shriek of a locomotive whistling a crossing told him where he was. He traveled too often with the judge not to know the sensation of riding in a baggage car. He opened his eyes, and into them came the unbridled anger of a kidnapped king. The man sprang for his throat, but Buck was too quick for him. His jaws closed on the hand, nor did they relax till his senses were choked out of him once more. "Yep, has fits," the man said, hiding his mangled hand from the baggage man who had been attracted by the sounds of a struggle. "I'm taking him up for the boss to Frisco. A crack doctor there thinks he can cure him." Now, none of that is true. Concerning the night's ride, the man spoke most eloquently for himself in a little shed back of a saloon on the San Francisco waterfront. "All I get is 50 for it," he grumbled, "and I wouldn't do it over for 1,000 cold cash." His hand was wrapped in a bloody handkerchief, and the right trouser leg was ripped from knee to ankle. "How much did the other mug get?" the saloon keeper demanded. 100, was the reply. "Wouldn't take a sou less, so help me." "Well, that makes 150, the saloon keeper calculated, and he's worth it, or I'm a squarehead. The kidnapper undid the bloody wrappings, looked at his lacerated hand. "If I don't get the hydrophobia, which is rabies, I'll be because you were born to hang," laughed the saloon keeper. "Here, lend me a hand before you pull your freight," he added. Dazed, suffering intolerable pain from his throat and tongue, with the life half throttled out of him, Buck attempted to face his tormentors, but he was thrown down and choked repeatedly till they succeeded in filing the heavy brass collar from off his neck. Then the rope was removed and he was flung into a cage-like crate. There he lay for the remainder of the weary night, nursing his wrath and wounded pride. He could not understand what it all meant. What did they want with him, these strange men? Why were they keeping him pent up in this narrow crate? He did not know why, but he felt oppressed by the vague sense of impending calamity. Several times during the night, he sprang to his feet when the shed door rattled open, expecting to see the judge, or the boys at least. But each time it was the bulging face of the saloon keeper that peered in at him by the sickly light of the tallow candle. And each time the joyful bark that trembled in Buck's throat was twisted into a savage growl. But the saloon keeper let him alone, and in the morning 4 men entered and picked up the crate. More tormentors, Buck decided, for they were evil-looking creatures, ragged and unkempt, and he stormed and raged at them through the bars. They only laughed and poked sticks at him, which he promptly assailed with his teeth till he realized that that was what they wanted. Whereupon he lay down sullenly and allowed the crate to be lifted into a wagon. Then he and the crate in which he was imprisoned began a passage through many hands. Clerks in the express office took charge of him. He was carted about in another wagon. A truck carried him with an assortment of boxes and parcels upon a ferry steamer. Now, a ferry steamer is a ship that normally carries cars and trucks and that kind of thing, but they also sometimes carry freight. He was trucked off the steamer into a great railroad depot, and finally he was deposited in an express car, which is still a train. For 2 days and nights, this express car was dragged along at the tail of shrieking locomotives. And for 2 days and nights, Buck neither ate nor drank. In his anger, he had met the first advances of the express messengers with growls, and they had retaliated by teasing him. When he flung himself against the bars, quivering and frothing, they laughed at him and taunted him. They growled and barked like detestable dogs, mewed and flapped their arms and crowed. It was all very silly, he knew, but therefore the more outrage to his dignity, and his anger waxed and waxed. He did not mind the hunger so much, but the lack of water caused him severe suffering and fanned his wrath to fever pitch. For that matter, high-strung and finely sensitive, the ill treatment had flung him into a fever, which was fed by the inflammation of his parched and swollen tongue and throat. He was glad for one thing the rope was off his neck. That had given them an unfair advantage, but now that it was off, he would show them. They would never get another rope around his neck. Upon that he was resolved. For 2 days and nights he neither ate nor drank, and during those 2 days and nights of torment, he accumulated a fund of wrath that boded ill for whoever first foul of him. His eyes turned bloodshot, and he was metamorphosed into a raging fiend. So changed was he that the judge himself would not have recognized him, and the express messengers breathed with relief when they bundled him off the train at Seattle. 4 men gingerly carried the crate from the wagon into a small, high-walled backyard. A stout man with a red sweater that sagged generously at the neck came out and signed the book for the driver. That was the man, Buck divined, the next tormentor, and he hurled himself savagely against the bars. The man smiled grimly and brought a hatchet and a club. "You ain't going to take him out now?" the driver asked. "Sure," the man replied, driving the hatchet into the crate for a pry. There was an instantaneous scattering of the 4 men who had carried it in, and from safe perches on top the wall, they prepared to watch the performance. What do they think is going to happen? They think that Buck is going to attack this man, and that this man has no idea how ferocious he is. Buck rushed at the splintering wood, sinking his teeth into it, surging and wrestling with it. Wherever the hatchet fell on the outside, he was there on the inside, snarling and growling, as furiously anxious to get out as the man in the red sweater was calmly intent on getting him out. "Now, you red-eyed devil," he said, when he'd made an opening sufficient for the passage of Buck's body. At the same time, he dropped the hatchet and shifted the club to his right hand. And Buck was truly a red-eyed devil as he drew himself together for the spring, his hair bristling, mouth foaming, a mad glitter in his bloodshot eyes. Straight at the man, he launched his 140 pounds of fury, surcharged with the pent passion of 2 days and nights. And here's a picture of it. In midair, just as his jaws were about to close on the man, he received a shock that checked his body and brought his teeth together with an agonizing clip. He whirled over, fetching the ground on his back and side. He had never been struck by a club in his life and did not understand. With a snarl that was part bark and more scream, he was again on his feet and launched into the air. And again the shock came, and he was brought crushingly to the ground. This time he was aware that it was the club, but his madness knew no caution. 12 times he charged, and as often the club broke the charge and smashed him down. After a particularly fierce blow, he crawled to his feet, too dazed to rush. He staggered limply about, the blood flowing from his nose, mouth, and ears. His beautiful coat sprayed and flecked with bloody slobber, like slobber. Then the man advanced and deliberately dealt him a frightful blow on the nose. All the pain he had endured was as nothing compared with the exquisite agony of this. With a roar that was almost lion-like in his ferocity, he again hurled himself at the man, but the man, shifting the club from right to left, coolly caught him in the underjaw, at the same time wrenching downward and backward. Buck described a complete circle in the air and half of another, and then crashed to the ground on his head and chest. For the last time he rushed, the man struck the shrewd blow he had purposely withheld for so long, and Buck crumbled up and went down, knocked utterly senseless. "He's no slouch at dog breaking, that's what I say," one of the men on the wall cried enthusiastically. "Druther break cayuses any day, and twice on Sundays," was the reply of the driver as he climbed on the wagon and started the horses. Buck's senses came back to him, but not his strength. He lay where he had fallen, and from there he watched the man in the red sweater. "Answers to the name of Buck," the man soliloquized, quoting from the saloon keeper's letter which had announced the consignment of the crate and contents. "Well, Buck, my boy," he went on in a congenial voice, "we've had our little ruction, and the best thing we can do is to let it go at that. You've learned your place, and I know mine. Be a good dog and all'll go well, and the goose hang high. Be a bad dog, and I'll whale the stuffing out of you. Understand?" As he spoke, he fearlessly patted the head he had so mercilessly pounded. And though Buck's hair involuntarily bristled at the touch of the hand, he endured it without protest. When the man brought him water, he drank eagerly, and later bolted a chunk meal of raw meat, a chunk by chunk from the man's hand. He was beaten, he knew that, but he was not broken. He saw once and for all that he stood no chance against a man with a club. He'd learned the lesson, and in all his afterlife he never forgot it. That club was a revelation. It was his introduction to the realm of primitive law, and he met the introduction halfway. The facts of life took on a fiercer aspect, and while he faced that aspect uncowed, he faced it with all the latent cunning of his nature aroused. As the days went by, other dogs came in crates and at the ends of ropes, some docilely and some raging and roaring as he had come. And one and all, he watched them pass under the dominion of the man in the red sweater. Again and again, as he looked at each brutal performance, the lesson was driven home to Buck. A man with a club was a lawgiver, a master to be obeyed, though not necessarily consolated. On this last, Buck was never guilty, although he did see beaten dogs that fawned upon the man and wagged their tails and licked his hand. Also, he saw one dog that was neither conciliate nor obey. And that dog was finally killed and struggled for mastery. Now and again, men came, strangers who talked excitedly, wheedlingly, and in all kinds of fashions to the man in the red sweater. And at such times that money passed between them. The strangers took one or more of the dogs away with them. Buck wondered where they went, for they never came back. But the fear of the future was strong upon him, and he was glad each time when he was not selected. Yet his time came, in the end, in the form of a little weazened man who spat broken English and many strange, uncouth exclamations which Buck could not understand. "Sacre dame!" he cried when his eyes lit upon Buck. "Dat one damn bully dog, eh? How much?" 300 and a present at that, was the prompt reply of the man in the red sweater. "And seeing it's government money, you ain't got no kick coming, eh, Perrault?" Perrault grinned, considering that the price of dogs had boomed skyward by the unwanted demand. It was not an unfair sum for such a fine animal. The Canadian government would be no loser, nor would its dispatches travel the slower. Perrault knew dogs, and when he looked at Buck, knew that he had 1 in 1,000. 1 in 10,000, he commented mentally. Buck saw money pass between them and was not surprised when Curly, a good-natured Newfoundland, and he were led away by the little weazened man. That was the last he saw of the man, I've turned the page, in the red sweater. And as Curly and he looked at receding Seattle from the deck of the Narwhal, it was the last he saw of the warm Southland. Curly and he were taken by Perrault and turned over to a black-faced giant called François. Perrault was a French-Canadian and swarthy. It's dark. But François was a French-Canadian half-breed and twice as swarthy. It means he was part Native American. Or in Canada, they call them of the First Nation. We used to call them Indians. They were a new kind of men to Buck, of which he was destined to see many more. And while he developed no affection for them, he nonetheless grew honestly to respect them. He speedily learned that Perrault and François were fair men, calm and impartial in administering justice, and too wise in the way of dogs to be fooled by dogs. And there's a picture of Perrault, and you can see him standing there with his winter coat and his hat and his pipe and boots. They're headed for the north. In the 'tween decks of the Narwhal, Buck and Curly joined 2 other dogs. One of them was a big snow-white fellow from Spitzbergen who had been brought away by a whaling captain and who had later accompanied a geological survey into the Barrens. He was friendly, in a treacherous sort of way, smiling into one's face the while he meditated some underhand trick, as for instance when he stole from Buck's food at the first meal. As Buck sprang to punish him, the lash of François' whip sang through the air, reaching the culprit first, and nothing remained to Buck but to recover the bone. That was fair of François, he decided, and the half-breed began to rise in Buck's estimation. The other dog made no advances nor received any. Also, he did not attempt to steal from the newcomers. He was a gloomy, morose fellow, and he showed Curly plainly that all he desired was to be left alone, and further, that there would be trouble if he were not left alone. Dave, he was called, and he ate and slept or yawned between times and took interest in nothing, not even when the Narwhal crossed Queen Charlotte Sound and rolled and pitched and bucked like a thing possessed. When Buck and Curly grew excited, half wild with fear, he raised his head as though annoyed, favored them with an incurious glance, yawned, and went to sleep again. Day and night the ship throbbed to the tireless pulse of the propeller. And though one day was very like another, it was apparent to Buck that the weather was steadily growing colder. At last one morning the propeller was quiet, and the narwhal was pervaded with an atmosphere of excitement. He felt it, as did the other dogs, and knew that a change was at hand. François leashed them and brought them on deck. At the first step upon the cold surface, Buck's feet sank into a white, mushy something very like mud. He sprang back with a snort. More of this white stuff was falling through the air. He shook himself, but more fell upon him. He sniffed it curiously, then licked some up with his tongue. It bit like fire, and the next instant was gone. What do you think this is? Well, we'll see. This puzzled him. He tried it again with the same result. The onlookers laughed uproariously, and he felt ashamed. He knew not why, for it was his first snow. Well, seems like he's settling down a little bit, has a friend or two among the other dogs, and is in good care with François. Maybe everything will turn out all right for Buck. Or maybe it won't. We do have this much more to read. Bye-bye.